Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Bulbulia. He is currently a professor in the School of Humanities, Faculty of Arts at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where he was appointed the Maclaurin Goodfellow Chair in Theological and Religious Studies in 2018. Dr. Bulbulia is regarded as one of the founders of the contemporary evolutionary religious studies. He is a past president of the International Association for the Cognitive Science of Religion and is currently co-editor of Religion, Brain and Behavior. Dr. Bulbulia is one of four on the senior management team of the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, a 20-year longitudinal study tracking over 15,000 New Zealanders every year. He is an associate investigator for Pulotu, a database of 116 Pacific cultures purpose-built to investigate the evolutionary dynamics of religion. And finally, in 2016, Dr. Bulbulia won a Research Excellence Award at Victoria University. So, Dr. Bulbulia, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you, Ricardo. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So let me first ask you, because I've already talked with a couple of people about the cognitive science of religion, like Dr. Robert Macaulay, Justin Barrett, Azim Sharif, and others. And so I would first like to ask you, what are the sorts of topics that you're specifically interested in when it comes to this field? Because I guess that there are a lot of things that one could study, right?
Religion is powerful, and it's a feature of the human condition and has always been so. And even in places where traditional religious affiliation is dropping, we see large populations of people who are expressed to spiritual beliefs. And even among those who have no spiritual beliefs, we have an interest in cultivating virtues, community, and acknowledging our dependencies on the world around us, on the past, with a view to making the future better. So these are core features of traditional religions. And that's long been my interest. It's a multifaceted dimension of the human condition. And I began thinking about religion as a set of beliefs and practices that combine in ways that are biologically puzzling because they're costly, and sought to explain them with the tools of evolutionary biology and the tools of, I guess, cognitive science, broadly speaking. How do people think? How does the world evolve? And why is it that we tend to think in ways that are predictable, that lead to non-random patterns of variation? We see these beliefs and commitments coming together differently, but always in ways that tend to motivate people to interact with each other. And so that's my previous interest. And of course, that's spilled out into many diverse projects. But is the question about which projects I'm interested in now? Is that what you...
perhaps the components of the religious phenomenon, if we could call it that you're most interested in studying.
Yes. Well, I guess in the past we were interested in how beliefs and behaviors were ritualistic behaviors, so behaviors that are connected to the beliefs. How do those systems come together in ways that ostensibly, although they may look to be very puzzling, for example, people piercing themselves with objects. We have studies showing that those behaviors, though puzzling, tend to bind societies together in ways that are that make people more predictable, and that are also somewhat surprising. In those particular sets of studies, we understood that people would become not only connected with others within their immediate ritual group, but will become connected with others across ethno-linguistic divides. But that was always taking like a kind of cross-section of a phenomenon, a ritual. People have these beliefs, they have these behaviors, we study them before and after, and we get a systematic understanding of the differences of the ritual behavior and the belief system on social behaviors, right? We have comparison, contrasting conditions, and so we get a sense of the magnitude of these differences. But it's always just taking people at one point in their life. And so when we look to the classical theological traditions and philosophical traditions, we look at, say, the work of Aristotle, the work of the Mozi and Indian philosophers, we find that there's a broader conception of the place of these practices within a life that is good. It's essential, and within a society that's good. So even Machiavelli would write about the role of religion as a vehicle for coordinating the activities of populations. And religion in these settings were, context of worship. How do people worship? And how does cultivating worship within a society enable monarchies or republics to be virtuous? And at the level of individuals, what do those kinds of practices do to make life good? So we're trying to think about a longer period of time within an individual's life and individuals within communities over time. We're trying to extend the time series data, I guess, would be the kind of key point of interest. So I'm doing that in two particular projects. One, building a database of Pacific religious diversity, which was funded to look at the evolutionary dynamics of societies with a finer grained understanding of the rituals and the social forms and the ecologies and the patterns of trade, to better understand the role of religion in stabilizing and potentially destabilizing these societies over a period of historical time. So we're now talking centuries. And then also at the level of individuals by looking at people in a broadly secular society, or a society that's a majority secular, to understand, well, what forms of community and connection help people to overcome adversity, help people to interact across cultural differences. And New Zealand has just suffered some terrible domestic right-wing terrorist attacks. And so we want to understand, what are the sources of acceptance in a society that is decreasingly institutionally religious? And so that requires data. And the only data we can get are data that take a lifetime to acquire. Think about your own life. What's made it good? What's made it difficult? How do you get over things? As the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune come in, who is it that what is it that's enabled you to get through this? And some of those might be personality features of you that don't have to do with your conditions. So we want to piece out those components. And that's the kind of national longitudinal study that we're undertaking right now. Mm-hmm. But I think the summary is get a bigger picture and get a picture of the diversity of community-making activities that are connected to acknowledging the sources of our existence and continuance in life. So I think that that's the kind of key part of religion that I'm interested in. When people build churches and when they build temples and they try to educate their kids, it's with a view to, belief is part of that and ritual is part of it, but it's in the context of really of piety. What is it that made us? And how do we appropriately acknowledge those dependencies? Now, this is something that I think secular people who don't have the belief systems really want to do as well. It's part of who we are, is to understand where we came from, what needs to be acknowledged as a source of our dependency and existence, and where do we go with that understanding. So we see, ecology, the major challenges to the world today, political stability, centered on those kinds of questions. So in that sense, I think religion's not just a place of, doesn't just occur in a place of worship. It's part of communities outside that. So.
Right. So perhaps later in the interview we will come back to some of the topics that you've just referred to in your answer. But let me first ask you, because a big part of my show has been focusing on evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory applied to human psychology and human behavior particularly. So I would like to ask you, first of all, if we could talk about religion or religious thinking at least as a mental phenomenon by itself, and if so, from an evolutionary perspective, is it better for us to approach it as perhaps a byproduct of other adaptations of the human mind? Or is it by any chance possible to talk about religion itself as an adaptation?
Yeah, well, I mean, every biological system begins as an error of some kind. The classical theories of evolution, there's random variation, and the variation that is selected is variation that has to do with the propagation of ideas. So I think when we're talking about byproduct theories, we can we want to really figure out what it is that we're talking about. So many people who are describing themselves as byproduct theories have a particular evolutionary hypothesis. So for example, a viral theory of religion, that it's an adaptation, but it's not ours. It's an adaptation of ideas, which when they are attended to, tend to propagate. Gossip is like this. There's a kind of evolutionary dynamic at the level of the ideas. And we can understand religion better by reverse engineering components of those ideas to see what it is about them that enables them to propagate. Write me down, believe me or else. Those are interesting hypotheses that are adaptationist, but they're not saying that the human brains, the kind of and human cultures, educational regimes, and that were evolved to support religious ideas in ways that benefit people. Okay, so those are evolutionary hypotheses. And what we want to do is to test these hypotheses. You might have one theory, it seems good to you. And so quite a lot of what happened, I remember when I got started at this, I read two books. One was Daniel Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, a wonderful book that just clarifies with Dennett's remarkable ability to convey complex ideas simply, just the essence of these Darwinian ideas. And he had this kind of theory. It's an accident. It's a benefiting. The beliefs evolved to benefit themselves, not us. And then the other book was Stuart Guthrie's Faces in the Clouds. We have these kind of projective tendencies. We want to see people everywhere, and there's a kind of cost benefit to that. And no one at the time was thinking that the features of religious belief, well, I would say the adaptationists or the people who were in the naturalistic study of religion were not thinking that the features of the belief systems and the ritual systems evolved to benefit people, to enable people to become more predictably cooperative. And reading economists at the time, and I began to think about how it is that the components of the behaviors identify specific features of the beliefs that are making me predictable. If you and I believe in the same set of a reality that rewards our interaction, tells us that that's what we must do, and I can ostensibly perceive that you're committed, you're not faking it because I can tell you from your behaviors, from your emotions, that you are on my side. Well, we become more predictably cooperative. We'll go farther together. But that was a particular evolutionary hypothesis. It was one in which the ostensible costs of religion make sense as features of an adaptive complex. At that time, I was thinking in terms of biological evolution, and then I came across these behavioral ecologists who were thinking more about the ritualistic stuff, and I could think about the belief stuff and the cognitive components, and we attempted to kind of reverse engineer religion as a set of tools that were transmitted in their genetic components and cultural components because they helped people. Yeah, not inevitably, and not always, and not everywhere, and perhaps never more in the future because the world has changed in ways that could make religion destabilizing. We had no commitment to those kind of ideas, but we did want to examine those hypotheses that religion wasn't involved. But everything starts out as an accident, just some tendency to imagine the world. So in that sense, we weren't holding a view that was inconsistent with, say, Guthrie's view that people have projective human quality, but we were saying that we can explain the ratification of that tendency through selection as occurring because it benefits people. And it kind of makes sense, like if you're sick, if you have a virus, there's nothing easier. Imagine you could get over it just by thinking differently. Well, if I have a belief system that's making me sick, I could get over it by just thinking differently. I'd be better off. I wouldn't be doing these crazy, these things that are costly, that require calories, that require time, that prevent me from doing what an anthropologist from Mars would think to be the essential business of life. Removing myself from that and undertaking such practices that make no sense. That would seem easy for that selection not to ratify that kind of system. And whether you love religion, you get up on a Sunday, you can't wait to get to church, or whether you get up on a Sunday and think, how does anyone go to church? It's kind of, you can understand the phenomenon better by, we argued, by reverse engineering those features as transmitted for specific functionalist purposes. And that took us, I think, a good way to, I would say there's a consensus view now. It's not everyone's view, but the consensus view is certainly that it's not accidental that this stuff gets transmitted. Some of our more recent work, though, has been looking at more, since the Holocene, the evolution of religions, of systems, ritual and belief that tend to establish social inequality. So someone benefits from this, elites benefit, and then they can foster greater coordination across a society by enacting violent rituals. We looked at ritual human sacrifice as a kind of stepping stone to consolidating elite power. Mm-hmm. So that, you can still have the adaptationist view and think that religion might not be equally good for everyone. And that's been very exciting because it's opened up, I guess, perspectives that it's enlarged a set of hypotheses. The hypothesis space has been enlarged, and people are actually going out and trying to test the predictions of these hypotheses on the basis of evidence that we don't already have to hand. We don't know. Gotta find predictions that that the hypotheses make, and then use the evidence to adjust our beliefs in the hypotheses. And so it's become a science over the last, say, 15 years. Tremendously exciting because religion is so, again, like it, or leave it. It's a part of human society. Mm-hmm. So,
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the cognitive mechanisms that operate in human minds and that give rise to religion, and also perhaps how it manifests socially, I mean, is there anything special about religion, or those same mechanisms also operate in other, let's say, social institutions, like, for example, politics and things like that?
Yeah. Let me just describe some features of religion that are puzzling, that make it look to be somewhat different. Religion is belief and commitment to a supernatural or supernormal world, ancestors, right, ghosts, that kind of thing. So, though the beliefs are highly motivating, there's an enormous diversity of beliefs, right? So why is it that the beliefs are diverse? What explains that? And why is it that they're highly motivating, but on the basis of what we take to be, I guess, evidence that's experiential or internal? If I say to you, my grandmother's here in the room, my evidence isn't evidence that's publicly available to you typically, right? So how is it that people become like that? And then why is it that it motivates? So I have sets of beliefs like saying an afterlife, but that I remain worried about the afterlife. I'm kicking and dragging to the fire. I don't want to go there. But if you tell me I'm going on a holiday in Fiji, I can't wait to get there. Get me on the airplane, sort of thing. So the beliefs, if you tell me, it's raining, I grab my umbrella, I go outside, it's not raining. I adjust those beliefs. But when we look at sacred beliefs, they don't adjust like that. They don't tend to adjust like that. So they seem to be picked up effortlessly by children, not all children, but and then they carry on into adulthood. That's interesting. It's different from ordinary empirical beliefs. But it's not so different from, say, ideological beliefs. What would get me to change my mind about, I don't know, climate or something? Maybe I'd have to. What sets of evidence would I tend to be perhaps more anchored in some beliefs than my education justifies. So I don't want to. What would get me to relax my views about the sacredness of equality and acceptance within a society? I can't even imagine that. So, and many other people who don't count themselves as religious would have those sets of beliefs that they're not going to change, they're not going to update easily, and that so religion and politics become these domains in which conversation can lead to conflict. So in that sense, the properties of these beliefs are linked to the properties of, say, political ideologies and other kind of social beliefs. And what's the core feature that they share? Well, they make us more predictable. We know how we're going to behave. And if you're thinking about a species, we need that kind of backbone of predictability in order to interact with each other in ways that are stable and ultimately facilitate our joint success. How those systems work, how they evolve, remains the diversity across cultures, the diversity within individuals over time, the developmental trajectories, the patterns of variation within populations, distinct populations in those trajectories, remain questions for the future. Hardly anything is known. If we go and read Freud, for example, who wrote a book, Future of an Illusion, the key questions that he described in his work on religion at the end of his career were questions that have yet to be resolved. When he says religion is in many ways not a neurosis, it's not like a delusion. features of religion appear to be delusional. Your wishes conform with the reality. It might be true. It's quite an interesting book. He wasn't denying the truth of this stuff, but he's saying, isn't it lucky if that happens that way? Well, but it's not, people live longer. They tend to do better. They tend to be actually balanced in many ways, many dimensions of their life that those who don't have those beliefs are not, pivot points for just making decisions. And so how that actually works remains unclear. I can't say, to me, looking at this stuff as a scholar of religion, that ever looked to be accidental and just like ordinary belief, or like the early theories where it's just the familiar made strange. It's just an uncanny, slightly minimally modified idea that then transmits because it's uncanny. I don't know, just the costs around that, the production of the world, the sacred theaters that we find in every city. We've just constructed a world map of all the churches on the planet. They're everywhere. That doesn't look to be the kind of minimally counterintuitive idea. But how that works, I don't know. And that's exciting. Mm-hmm. I think if you pour into the literatures and you find it that they challenge you to think about religion, if you look at the literatures and you fail to find a good fit, then that, like me, in my own case, that reveals a set of opportunities for research, a set of projects to conduct.
Mm-hmm. So in your answer, you've alluded to things like ideology, beliefs, and stuff like that. So, but isn't it the case that it is not that easy to establish a causal relationship between beliefs that people hold and actions that they perform? That is, there's not always a one-to-one correspondence between a belief and an action, right?
Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. Causation is tricky business, and but what we do, but we don't need to have every theory proved and vindicated now. How does the science work? What's the relationship between a set of grammatical features in a language and a theory about universal grammar, for example? Well, that remains unsettled. So we try, people find counterexamples to a theory of human grammar as being universal. We know that the domain of human languages is bounded. Kids learn it quickly in advance of the exposures, the predictable features, errors that kids never make, like the coordinate structure constraint, and knew about these parts of language that, potentially grammatical languages remain inaccessible to humans, so it's bounded. And yet, what is the universal theory? We don't have it. So when we think about even the relationship between beliefs and actions, beliefs, that's science. We don't know how cells work. The causal mechanisms by which cells communicate at the border between, physics and life is unclear. So we go into this exactly with real, the kind of intellectual humility that characterizes science, and understand that though it seems that way to me, who knows? And very clever people come up with, causal tests. But what that typically does is we have a set of predictions that's consistent with the theory. So I'll give you an example from our own Pulotu database. We had theories that, more religions with moralistic properties. So ideas of afterlives, ideas that of being observed, not necessarily of a big God everywhere, but what I do is part of a world where morally invested observers are present. With theories that those kinds of beliefs, when they emerged, would tend to be ratified and tend to anticipate complex societies. And that's what we found in the Pulotu database. By the way, that's consistent also with the archaeological records. People have been writing about this Durkheim's teacher Fustel de Couillon's had a set of theories about the way in which ritualistic piety to the ancestors in the context of the ancient world leads to the emergence of property rights, which then enable specific agricultural capacities to evolve from the vantage point of people working their own land, a set of taxation in political systems, which then are taking from the surpluses in ways that can facilitate the emergence of elite priestly classes, which then can coordinate larger groups. We can see in the archaeological record a time step progression where we think, okay, well, that probably did arise as in a world where the causal vectors tended to support systems which then anchor those beliefs and then coordinate them across ethno-linguistic lines intergenerationally, making people more predictable. So we do find, that evidence is consistent with that picture. But if someone held a view that was slightly different, a more accidental view, well, we want to test it on the predictions. And I think the juries, although they're emerging consensus, the juries are very much out, as they will be for a long time, on how those specific mechanisms operate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's talk about ritual, because I guess this is a big part of religion and religious phenomena, right? So, what are perhaps the most important aspects of rituals that really help us understand the sorts of effects that they have on people? And perhaps what are also the functions or the social functions that rituals serve when it comes to religion?
Yeah, I'll talk about the first part, the effects, through work that I've been involved with in collaboration with former PhD student Paul Reddish and my colleagues at Victoria University, where we would look at the control systematically the synchronous behaviors of people. There had been some preliminary studies that when people were acting in synchrony and aligning themselves in their movements, they would tend to align themselves socially in ways that led to greater cooperation, greater rapport. And we wanted to test that. And when Paul began to try to replicate the synchrony effects in the laboratory, we found very weak effects that were muted. And in fact, a funny story was, this was before I knew much about psychology and the way in which data can mislead researchers. Paul was collecting data on synchrony, was finding these weak effects, and he peeked at the data first, and an advisor thought, oh, well, you're finding those effects, why not write it up? But Paul had said he was going to collect 150 data points. We're only 60 into it. So he continued, and the effect just disappeared. It just drifted out. And so it created a set of puzzles. And this, and Paul came from government, where he was kind of asked to be given the right, the right result in advance. And he wasn't going to do that in his PhD. It was wonderful. So we're just puzzled, and we're thinking, oh, well, we can't publish this, or it's just a result that fails to support the experimental hypothesis. But that forced us to think, well, what is it about ritualistic synchrony that differs? Well, there's a common goal. And so in the experimental conditions, what Paul thought to do is to get people to do exactly the same behaviors. In one context, they were trying to hit a trigger, and the goal condition was try to do it better than those around you. And another was so that was the individualistic goal, and the other was the cooperative goal. Try to do it in synchrony with each other, exactly in time. So you're being rewarded on the basis of how collaborative you are. And we could vary synchrony and asynchrony, and it turns out that asynchrony is quite hard to enforce because people tend to synchronize. So we had to get them with internal metronomes. And what what we discovered is that that combination of having the same goal and moving together makes people more cooperatively predictive. We looked at an economic game where everyone benefits if we cooperate, but it's a bit risky. You only get the benefit if everyone cooperates. If one person defects, all the cooperative benefit is lost, and that one person who defects gets a lesser gain than the defector would have got had the defector cooperated, right? So it's everyone's motivation is to cooperate, right? But there's that risk if someone doesn't, the gain's lost. And Paul played around with the amounts of reward and found that, if you could get $7 just automatically, that was a sort of sweet spot. Many people would go for that, or they'd predict others would go for it, and so they'd take it because they're like, of course I want. If I predicted everyone would take the 10 rather than the 7, I'll go for the 10. And the condition where there was the common goal and the synchronous behavior was an enactment of cooperation in a way that made people more predictable. And then when we wrote the path models, the causal models, well, this predicts this, this predicts this. Pseudo-causal, because we're just looking at relationships between variables in our data set. We found that the strongest model was one where the synchrony was enabling people to predict future cooperation, cooperativeness of others, and that then predicted trust. And I can trust each other, and that predicted behavior. So something about the movement in synchrony, the alignment in time, and this kind of coordination around a common goal. Hey, we're in it together. And it was a simple goal. It was just, that's the task. Well, imagine how much more powerful it would be if we have a kind of sacred cause underneath that. That looks to be a component of behavior and a kind of framing of behavior through a set of explicit ideas, just not movements, accidental, that leads to a kind of prediction of that people are going to be cooperative, that leads to trust, and that leads to my behaving in a cooperative way. We also looked at this in the setting, naturalistic setting of activities that people do, from running to playing cards, which is explicitly competitive, to singing in a choir. I was really hoping the runners would do well because I was a part of a running team, and the runners were actually among the worst in terms of their behaving in ways that were coordinated in time, but maybe too competitive for them to really cooperate with each other. So yeah, those are the effects of rituals, acting together in time in a coordinated way that is framed within a set of shared goals, looks to be the kind of behavior that supports cooperative prediction and then trust. Now imagine those features of the behavior have elements of challenge and adversity. You're getting pierced, you're recollecting the worst possible defeats, the death of a god, that kind of thing. But that you're overcoming that within a ritualistic setting. You see that, that can then frame in an embodied way how people predict what's going to happen next and how they behave, what they trust. And so that arguably helps to make sense of the components of the ritualistic practice. Why do we find sort of ritual adversity everywhere? Well, perhaps because that enactment helps us to become more trusting. It's resolved. People succeed at the end. We'll overcome that in real life when it happens. Well, those are the theories. What about the cognitive components of ritual? So I'm talking about all this stuff as if it's just functional, accidental, that kind. And as I was mentioning before, I've been reading more about the classical theories of virtue, both from people who are religious, like St. Thomas Aquinas, to people who are not, like Cicero and Varro and Machiavelli and others. And religion is a virtue within a society. It's distinct from the virtue of faith. Faith is a gift in the kind of Christian traditions. You can be held accountable to it if you've been given the gift. You can be tortured if you don't uphold it. But religion was a different virtue. It was a virtue of justice, which is acknowledging a dependency. You give something to the god because the god's responsible for your life. It's part of what you do when when the lines of of exchange are asymmetrical. If you give me something, I give you something. That's a symmetrical dependency. That's a component of justice. But that's something we didn't do everything ourselves, right? And we can't take credit for our own lives. In the world we live in. So how do we acknowledge what we can't take credit for when we can't ever repay it either? Well, that gives rise to a sensibility of awe, a sense of rightfully recognizing the contributions of those who came before. Yeah. And so we see this across the Pacific, the emergence of kind of ancestor beliefs. And I kind of think to myself, well, the ancestors really were there. Maybe whether or not they're present in the room is, to my mind, irrelevant. We were dependent on them. We should acknowledge them, as a part of justice. And in doing so, how does that change us? How do we become more just in our behaviors? Those components of ritual might, be uncontroversially cognitive. I think when people say, for example, with this interest in ecology, they're saying, look, you got to protect that ecosystem even if you don't see it. It's underwater, that biodiversity. You got to protect it. Well, why do you have to protect it? Why should I protect it if I don't have that value? It's just your preference, your belief. No, well, actually, those dependencies are really there. They really happened in nature. We should think of, even if it's a blind evolutionary process, we shouldn't just frustrate them in one, sweep of a fisherman's net or something. And we should protect that. Well, why should we protect it? Because that's what people are. We have these cognitive components of worship and piety that I think translate into other aspects of life, secular life. So in that sense, I'm interested in those ways in which religion is addressing what happened and how that affects us, in how that makes us behave differently in ways that are appropriate. So that's a challenge to kind of begin speaking in ways that are normative.
So another aspect that has to do with the rituals that you've also studied is the levels of arousal that people reach in certain specific kinds of rituals, where they really reach high levels of arousal, and that has some very specific effects on their minds, like, for example, effects at the level of their autobiographical memories and things like that, right?
Okay.
So could you tell us about that as well?
Oh, good questions, Ricardo. You've done your research, yeah. Well, that was, for me, that was the first, among the first studies that I did. I was trained as a philosopher, and I started thinking, how do we test this stuff? So colleague Dimitris Zigalates, who was a postdoctoral fellow at the time at Aarhus University, had these heart rate monitors, and we understood that we could actually get levels of synchrony and levels of heart rate variability from a baseline. We could see the kind of spiking of heart rate, and we could actually quantify the amount of arousal in a ritual. We could see how different, or we could capture the differences between people within a ritual setting, and then sat down, how can we use this to test theories about the way in which effervescence, as Emile Durkheim called it, affects our thoughts. Now, the theories about memory, we published papers on synchronous arousal within the context of a firewalking ritual, where we could see that people who were invested in the ritual were really becoming coordinated through the time episodes. So the heart rate, so the firewalkers especially were the most coordinated. Well, everyone kind of shouldn't be too surprised. If you're watching a sporting event, the World Cup soccer, and your team's in there, you're standing up, you're in coordination with others. But we could get the kind of magnitudes of that, which was interesting. It was kind of a proof of concept. And then there were surprises. So the theories at that time were that high arousal rituals elaborate memories. You get these kind of flashbulb effects because you're aroused and it's a key moment. And we thought that when we had people describe the ritual events, that they would have those flashbulb memories. And what we found was the opposite. They couldn't remember anything. They were so overwhelmed. You know, one of the oldest laws in psychology is Yerkes-Dodson's law, where if you have it's an inverted U, right? And then if you have a little bit of arousal, if you don't have enough arousal, you don't remember anything. You just, or you don't perform. If you have the sweet spot, you're getting that kind of maximum performance. If you're over aroused, performance drops out again. And that's what we kind of saw Yerkes-Dodson effect here, where people were very aroused. The firewalkers just, they weren't even present. And the qualitative data that Demetrius was capturing, don't you remember I was talking to you about this thing? No, I don't remember anything. Were you there? I don't remember talking to you about the images. I don't remember seeing you showing me them. They were just overwhelmed. And I went back to my own PhD defense and remembered and thought, I don't remember anything about that. I was just nervous and it happened. So, but then we could find that people were inserting social memories after the event, that they kind of had a coordinated memory of the whole ritual, that people who weren't there, placed there, and that there was better than random recall for when we pressed people. It suggests that there was some encoding of the event, but the access to that event was perturbed in some way. But so people were guessing correctly earlier in ways that suggested they did record something of it. Well, that was surprising, And then it was surprising that when we got into the data a bit more, we could see that although the arousal vector was up throughout the ritual, depending on the ritual role, the valence, whether it was positive or negative, was different. And what we found was that the walkers were mostly neutral and somewhat pained, not as much as you might expect, but the people that the firewalkers were carrying in this particular event, the firewalker takes a passenger, usually a close family member, and they were becoming increasingly aroused, but also increasingly happy. So we could see those dynamics. And again, that suggests differentiation within the ritual of ritual roles, that it's not just a kind of common effervescence that affects everyone equally. We could see that there's a structure within it. Well, how common is that structure? How does it affect people, not just in the short term, but the long term? What are the patterns of cultural variation? Those are all, outstanding questions. And again, it'd be a very exciting couple centuries ahead as people try to understand the bigger picture. It was nice to get those little demonstrations. It was the first time, I think, if you had gone through early on and read Dennett as I had and got interested in the selfish gene and Richard Dawkins and all that, to see that we could begin testing these ideas, that we didn't just have to have these irreconcilable hypotheses that people took to be true. Had to be that way. So that was that.
Mm-hmm. So earlier in the interview, you alluded to the importance of costly signaling in religion. So could you tell us about these two sort of opposite kinds of phenomena that are credibility enhancing displays on the one hand, and on the other hand, credibility undermining displays, and perhaps the sorts of effects that they have on people, and if perhaps the main effect here is about promoting trust among people, or any other sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, the costly signaling work, Veblen and economists a century ago were describing how it is that people can, through their economic behaviors, verify and compete along status gradients. So I might claim that I'm super wealthy, you might claim the same. I turn up in a Ferrari, so that's how people compete on the wealth gradient. But the wealth gradient isn't going to predict cooperation necessarily. I don't care about what car you drive. I want to know, are you going to be a good collaborator? Are you going to help me when the chips are down? Am I going to help you? Those are the kind of questions we want to get at. And so the costly signaling theories, the behavioral ecologists, William Irons was among the first, and Lee Cronk, who was an economist, had these ideas that you would that if there were cost structures within a religious setting, that those would help people, that would prevent the join, take, defect strategy within a community. Like, hey, if there's all sorts of insurance and benefits to belonging in a group that's highly cooperative, then that's almost like, a dinner bell for defectors. Come in there, there's the easy stuff. So if you have a kind of entrance requirement, that would be reducing. If you had to pay up front a bit, you might not want to do that. You might not predict. If the entrance requirements requires, so later on I was thinking about the belief components of that. Like, if they were really hard to fake effectively, then that would provide a mechanism for ensuring that the goods were not distributed to people who weren't going to be cooperative. So you need that kind of recognition in each other of. So if I start undertaking costs, if I start visibly affecting myself in a way that shows I'm committed to you and I'm not committed to them. If I understand, my graduate student, Andrew Marney, got a PhD looking at theology. Language is a way of, once you invest in it, you can't just learn another language. The theological vocabularies then can become vehicles for people to display in a status gradient their connection to the group, right? You see that in music. I learn every jazz standard that I'm the jazz, but it takes time and it prevents me from doing other things. So that was the kind of cost. So I guess, my work on that was on the cognitive and affective components of the behaviors to try to show. Okay, so we're thinking about the features of religious belief and behavior. We see that the behaviors that are harder to fake are the ones that are going to be ensuring that people really have those commitments, and they are going to be cooperative. So you can't buy a Ferrari or expensive clothing and prove your commitment, but you can if you're in part of a group that is whose entrance requirements are difficult and harder to fake. Only if you believe this and really have that effective connection would you actually learn all that stuff. And once you learn it, you can't go back and learn something else. Those sorts of dimensions of behavior would then become connected to beliefs in ways that enable people to be more cooperative. So that's that hard to fake idea within signaling theory. The credibility enhancing display idea was that, well, if you had moral virtuous models, well, then people would emulate them, and then that would then transmit at a population level the kind of virtues that would lead people to be more cooperative. And then similarly, if there were undermining people, that would tend to reduce imitation. So those were different theories about how it is that people use information to behave. And in those, if people were doing things that were exemplary, you have the heroes, and then they were copying them, then you could get the propagation of virtuous beliefs in society. Well, that requires a whole set of assumptions about how people learn. And it turns out, I think, in the ethnographic and historical records, that people just don't learn by imitating. They have to do. They have to be trained. There's a huge amount of developmental component. We see this, kids are actively guided to their beliefs. We don't always emulate virtuous people. The models themselves are not so virtuous. The priests are cutting hearts open and chucking them out. You don't want people to be doing that on the street. If you look at the ritual sacrifice systems of, say, the Aztecs, it's hard for me to see the credibility enhancing display as a kind of one-to-one connection between the virtuous behavior of a leader and what people do on the ground. But nevertheless, although the hypotheses might not have been so plausible, the idea that we want to see how this stuff scales up was beginning to emerge around that time frame, about 2009, 2010, because most of our interactions are not one-to-one. I don't observe your costly displays. I don't know what they're doing. I have to be operating on cues that, I need to look at symbolic behaviors and that. And that's, I think, a key shift in the broader trajectories of research on the evolution of religion that was occurring at that time. How do we get big societies? Yeah. And so those theories were about the display properties of religious elites or religious exemplars. Way to test them, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when it comes to people adhering to religion or to a specific religion that they have as part of their community or the population they live in, let's say, people tend to refer to, and even perhaps the atheists tend to refer sometimes to the fact that perhaps people who live in worse socioeconomic situations tend to adhere more easily to religion, and there are perhaps also other aspects of the environment, like for example when it occurs a natural disaster, like another one of the papers that you published, I think back in 2011, where there was a earthquake that affected New Zealand. So could you tell us about those sorts of things? Perhaps first, if really socioeconomic factors affect how people adhere to religion or not, and also that particular case of having to do with natural disasters.
Yeah, well, with the marginalization theories, that oppressed, the more you're oppressed, the more you need something transcendent to overcome the oppression, Marx and so forth. We, in the cross-sectional studies in New Zealand, if we look at the populations who believe and don't believe, we don't find that socioeconomic conditions predict who's believing now, right? That was kind of interesting. The strongest predictors were cultural, people from communities that had historically strong connections, mostly to Christianity in our data set, tended to be the people who were most connected now. So the Pacific communities were more. But there were plenty of rich people that were religious, about equal numbers of rich people that weren't. And then we looked at, down the economic gradients, plenty of people who don't have religion in the lower strata. But then as we look at the time course, we have unpublished work now over the age span. We see that although the national trend is to declining religion over time at the population level, within individuals over time, there's a greater tendency to convert to religion if you're not religious, and a declining tendency to deconvert if you are religious. So that means that deconversion is dropping and conversion is increasing. So the two processes are tending to make people more religious over time. So it's just that we have so many young people deconverting that the national average is in the opposite direction to secularization. Now, why is it that people tend to become more religious over the course of their lives? One theory is that you're encountering more adversity, and that's a response to adversity. So even if we don't see it in cross-sectional stuff, maybe there are these trends within the life and we are attempting to track those to see how do people respond to negative events. And also positive increases in wealth, does that lead to a greater disinclination to religion? So we're still testing those economic theories within subject, I guess, evidence. And I think the jury's out on that. The ecological data is stronger. And that was interesting because when we had the earthquakes in 2011 in Christchurch, which was a terrible, devastating loss of life and economic loss and just the insecurity of an underlying event that continues now, natural perturbance of these fault systems which lead to aftershocks, that there was a reversal in the population level of the trend to secularism. More people were identifying with religion than were not, as compared with the rest of the country. And so we could see that ecological stressor is connected to religious identification. We didn't have the belief questions in God then, so we couldn't test that specific theory, but they were more adhering to religion. Then we looked at does adherence actually lead people to have greater comfort? And we didn't find evidence for greater comfort. Now, perhaps the measures weren't good enough, we didn't have enough people, but overall is consistent with the predictions of the theory that religious communities tend to be places where people cooperate, and at times of stress, those communities become more salient, more important. So we would be predicting that there would be a greater increase in religious commitment, but we wouldn't necessarily think there's comfort associated with that. In fact, maybe a greater sense of stress would get you to be more cooperative. The dangers, when they're perceived, lead us to be even more connected with each other. So that's broadly consistent with that pattern. And then in 2014, we had a global study that was initiated by someone who was studying birds, Carlos Botero, and noted that there are these, that birds tend to be more cooperative. The pattern of global diversity of avian cooperation can be predicted by the relative stability and harshness of climate within specific regions, and thought, wow, could that work for humans? And that initiated conversations about religion. And what we found in the ethnographic atlas, in combination with very fine-grained historical evidence of climate instability and climate harshness, is that unstable, harsh environments are predictive of beliefs in moralizing religious systems. They tend to occur there. And that the model for cooperative prediction that we built, which included political, we don't think there's one causal driver of this, but we had politics, agriculture, we had the use of animals within agriculture. And what we found was that pattern of global diversity could be predicted with an accuracy of 91%, which was really, we took to be a very high level of predictive accuracy. And that is, again, consistent with this idea that, if there is a diversity in climate, then people will have a greater need for cooperation, that those systems will become more relevant. So what does that predict? If we see greater instability in the future, if we see greater climate variability, perhaps people will begin returning to these communities where the features of which evolved, I take it, on the evidence for the purposes of cooperation. So you might see a resurgence of those forms of life, perhaps reinvented in new ways for our own time. But those were the two studies on climate that we have. And we're going to see whether they replicate. We had another set of earthquakes in Kaikoura, which were larger earthquakes, but they affected a smaller percentage of the population. We don't know if we'll get the signal, and that's the exciting part of science, whatever we get interesting. Mm-hmm. So we're preparing those now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting, but I mean, these things also interact with other aspects of human psychology, like, for example, personality, and also the moral foundations, right? Because, I mean, the five major moral foundations that Jonathan Haidt identified, at least three of them, they seem to be, to go very correlated with religiousness. That is, those three ones that are sort of binding moral foundations.
Yeah, the binding.
Like loyalty to the group, respect for authority, and sanctity, purity.
Sanctity.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so we actually had those measures in one of the waves of the longitudinal study, and we could see that they were predictive within religious communities. So if we ignore secular religious, the religious diversity was mapped onto those conservation values, the binding values, in ways that were predicted by moral foundations theory. And I like that theory myself, because it's a dimensional. I think there's 6 foundations now. It describes morality isn't just like do good, or help that person. It has to do with traditional elements, which, again, I think when they get fleshed out as religious studies scholars come together with moral psychologists, that get fleshed out in ways that are looking at the cultural elements. How is it? Well, then how is it that binding values get transmitted? What, if they just happen? Or kids just look at someone who's doing a role model and then they accept it? No, they had to go to church. They built these, these incredible vehicles for focusing the mind, their whole systems of education. And it could turn out, you were talking about the kind of, how much effort does it take really to get people to become religious? Well, we know there are ambient beliefs and spirits and so forth. We see this in populations that are not religious. But how do we get from the spirit to religion, that kind of piety? Perhaps you require quite a lot of scaffolding to get there. Ostensibly, it looks like the world was built for this. And so it's exciting to think about how foundations would work in an evolutionary setting, and what explains the diversity within a community. You're talking about personality, right? Those are big features, and they look to be, people's, where does personality come from? How much of it is learned? How much of it is part of our genetic endowment? When we think there's a fair amount of genetic endowment, so as we begin to understand that diversity, we might see very complex pictures that are, again, defying these simplistic, I learned from a role model and that's it. That's the population effect. It doesn't explain the variation within it. We have some exciting work with the Pulotu database that is coming out of Uri Alon's group in Israel. The physicists, biophysicists that are looking at, they have a paper on the, I think it's the bioarvics, looking at cultural differences within global patterns of religion as predicted by ecology, trade, and war. And so, that's going to be showing that certain societies have kind of personality types, which can be predicted by the opportunities and threats within a particular setting. So that will be, again, a more complex picture ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not sure at all if people simply are exposed to certain things in their environment and then that's why they develop their moral foundations, but I mean, there could also be the case that there's some innate aspect to them, and perhaps some people are more predisposed toward certain clusters, let's say, of moral foundations, and other people to others, like, for example, also coming from the work of Jonathan Haidt, he identified the major moral foundations that go associated with people that identify as liberals or conservatives. Yeah. So, I mean, they could have an innate aspect to them as well, right?
And to maybe sharpen that point, we can... that those questions are so fundamental. Like we're looking at the I guess the programming languages of life within cells, and we want to understand how cells build bodies, and we're just making kind of discoveries every day about how those systems are robust and how they manifest features of design in noisy environments, right? But we don't know about the programming languages of society. Of human psychology. Those questions about the diversity of a population and their orientations, which we can see, which are getting validated now when we begin to try to take snapshots. Yeah, we see those type. Why are they there? How did they get there? Where are they going? What difference does that make? The kind of core questions about what a society is, which need to be answered, I think, if we want to understand how to make society good, if we have certain goals like democracy, acceptance, economic stability, climate, all those sorts of questions rely on an understanding of these systems, the programming languages of society, of the mind. And we don't have that, right? We just have the snapshot. So, yeah, you're right. And why isn't everyone asking this question? Then becomes interesting. Like, why doesn't everyone want to know that? Yeah. It's seems to me overwhelmingly interesting. And I guess it has been encouraging to see that finally journals like Nature and Science are beginning to publish the very preliminary, and I think, in retrospect and hindsight, my own work, for example, will be embarrassingly weak as better people come along with better data sets and better methods to kind of really understand the mechanisms that give rise to that diversity of people and societies. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, as you were saying, I guess by studying religion, we're also studying, in a way, how people interact with one another in society, and perhaps that could also give us useful insights into how to solve some very pressing societal issues, even at the political level, right? For example.
Yeah. And it might give us, I take that even one step further. It might give us some insight into truth in ways that are surprising. And so if we begin to think about how it is that people reflect within a community context on what it is that we are dependent on, and how they express those reflections in ways that are not discursive, they're not linear. We convey sensibilities through art, through music, through I think through worship. If you look at these, that might enable people to have moments of understanding that you can't access just by talking with each other. If you hug someone, you're accessing something, and you can't put. It's hard to define what that is, but we know we might take that to be a very important activity. Not everything needs to be about, a kind of writing down of beliefs. And I think when especially in the Pacific context, when I'm interacting with Pacific communities that have song and food and highly ritualistic acceptance rituals, and I don't know what the beliefs are myself entirely, and I know the myths, but I don't know what's going. But I don't need to really think about that too much. I engage with it in a way that's open and honest, that I'm not part of that, but hey. And I think that there are forms of community that can emerge from that are that lead to better forms of being with each other. If we're sharing a meal, if we're accepting people through song, that can make life better. And also it can, in my own case, as I begin to think about what it is that I'm dependent on and what it is that I owe others, I'm thinking in a broader context as a result of the work I'm doing. Like, I didn't make this world, and I'm not going to be in it forever. And what is my response to what I understand about nature and biology and people? That seems to me something I owe in light of what I can't really repay. And I think that that's something I really owe, because I am the product of so many forces in the world, so many people, so many biological, in many cases, random events. But I want to understand that and then respond appropriately, and then acknowledge that. And I do that mainly through music and other forms of art, but I also do it by joining causes with people who are secular and religious, in against others who are secular and religious, but are what I take to be in need of greater justice. So yeah, I think so. I think that as we begin to think about religion, or as I think about it over now a 20-year career, I think I'm more open to learning from it in ways that aren't really simplistic. Belief this, belief not. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's better for us to really approach religion in a rigorous, scientific way instead of just, like some people do, dismiss religious people as irrational or stupid. Because, I mean, it is also the case that religion isn't going away anytime soon, and it seems that at least in the West it's been in declining, but the projections say that, for example, Muslims will
Oh,
grow in
yeah.
number because it seems that I'm not sure if it happens with all religions, but at least some religions tend to favor higher fertility
Yeah,
rates
that's
and
right.
things like that, right?
Yeah, so my colleague John Shaver and I have been working on some of this stuff. John had this idea that these are systems that are enabling cooperation. Extends the biggest cooperation problems are child rearing, and in the communities that have more capacity for child rearing, you're going to get higher fertility. And so when we look at the global projections, there's only two ways of changing the kind of population and their beliefs. One is through the inherited beliefs as kids are raised, and then conversion or deconversion, right? When we look at secular people, they don't have many kids. So even though there's a conversion out of some religious groups, it's not high enough to get that replacement value. So we see global projections of mainly the conservative religions growing in the future. So it's, again, whether you like it or not, that's something that we should understand. We should understand how that works. That's a reason to do science. And then but it would go both ways. I think, your community here is science interested and patient, and they might think, oh, well, religious people, how could they be so right? But then, I interact in circles where you have religious people that won't teach the kids evolution and that kind of thing. And they're just, it's like, you want to have a saner, more tolerant society. But what's encouraging about some of the events that took place, we have again, I'm speaking in a moment of national crisis and self-searching in this country, is there was an attack on people as they were Muslims, as they were worshiping, a brutal murder of over 50 people. And what's come out of that, I think, is that people are just attending worship services and not pretending to have beliefs that they don't have, but just acknowledging that people have those beliefs, listening to them, having more conversation, responding, and not trying to settle all beliefs into one unity. And I have this recurring image of a kind of a forest, a natural ecology that has this tree, that tree. Now, I don't want I don't want oaks everywhere, even if I'm an oak. I don't mind that diversity. I can learn from it, and I can allow that to be unresolved. What I mind is when people harm each other in various ways through that. And I think when people are thinking of what they are intolerant of in religion, they're intolerant of taking kids out of science and that kind of thing. But what they don't see at that moment that they're being intolerant, to have that example in mind, and they're right, and I resist that as strongly as anyone, but they don't see the people, say, in prisons that are working to find some redemption in the life of someone, to give them a kind of chance in the world, and to do the kind of, or they're not seeing the massive kind of untold story of charity that's happening, around natural disasters, that's happening ordinarily around housing, the care for the least of, the people in a society, that is occurring within the churches. The acceptance of people who are migrants that have no place to go, they don't see that kind of benefit. And they don't see the unsung ordinary heroes that are driving most of that work, that will never be known, but that are exemplary human beings. That's just not on their mind. They're thinking of rightfully thinking of the abusive cases. And there are many of those. So it's holding complex pictures. But again, once you have the capacity for complex picture, you understand that secular and religious people come together all the time against secular and religious people, that it's not a secular religious divide in human history. The civil rights, the anti-slavery movement, that was all part of people joining across those belief systems. And that's kind of educating ourselves about that and having a tolerance, finding those points of unity will be essential, I think, the major challenges ahead of us.
So, and I mean, it doesn't really matter if we are religious or not, because at the end of the day, there's a theme that cuts across religion and also other human activities, that is the one that has to do with meaning, and meaning, mainly meaning, the meaning of life, right? So people really have to do with this sort of existential things in their lives, and religion might be a source of meaning, but there are also other sources, of course. But I mean, that's a big thing that people really have to deal with in their lives, right?
People have used the word meaning system and meanings, and for me, it's that language. I get what they're saying, and I prefer the language of what's sacred. What is sacred? And I want to take the case of the fully secular person that doesn't believe in anything that's supernatural. There's only nature. There's only us, okay? And there won't be anything after we're gone. Can that person have a sense of the sacred? Or is that person owed a sense of the sacred? And I would argue yes, because everything that has happened, really happened, has resulted in the kind of creation of something that's unique, that's individual, and that's worth appreciating. Your life, the contributions you're making, say, to public education right now, are worth acknowledging because they change the world. And in acknowledging that, I'm understanding something that's real about the world. When I acknowledge an ecosystem and work to protect it and take some hits, I've looked at the ecology movement in New Zealand in the 1970s. They saved a large amount of natural native forests because they took personal hits against loggers. They were under threat in that. But they did it because those forests cannot be replaced once they're gone. Everything is, so what are we going to do? How are we going to, I see cultural heritage, being lost. I want to protect that. So that we should see ourselves as part of a larger history. Now, some people might see that history as anchored in gods that I don't believe in, ancestors that I don't attach any idea to that. Others might retain a sense of mystery about that. Others might just ignore that, but we all want to understand our place in a broader stretch of time. And what has happened has really happened. And there are incontrovertible facts that we know about. The world has happened. We're dependent on the past sacrifices of others. Anti-slavery didn't just happen. The women's rights movements didn't just happen. The forests that I just described didn't just happen. They were the result of individuals, caring enough about the world around them to make a difference. And so, we need the sacred. We're entitled to that. And then what gives us a sense of purpose in getting up in the mornings, that sense of being committed to justice. And I think everyone has that in them. And to the extent that we can cultivate that in people, that's the real challenge ahead. But that requires us to adopt a different vocabulary, I think. The vocabulary belief is the supernatural, and that maybe isn't the right way to kind of enter into an understanding of what the religious and secular systems are doing when they're working at their best, which is to identify what is sacred as best we can after our own beliefs and experiences, and with the best tools we can, and then to try to respond in ways that are appropriate. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask you if you would like perhaps to tell people what might be some of the best places on the internet if they want to get in touch with more of your work, or even perhaps some projects that you're working at the moment. I mean, anything like that.
I think I would go to the Pulotu database, Puloto. They can play around with the data set that we created for Pacific religious diversity. They can look at beliefs and rituals, and I think we have 50 variables that they can play with. And yeah, I just want to stay out of the way of these people. Like, if you're inspired by this, you're gonna, and you're young, and you'll come and you'll do much better than what we've done. So we'll stay out of the way. Take a look at that data set. There's the database of religious history. There's Shishot that's out there, and learn to think for yourself. Don't take my stuff too seriously. That's what I would want to. The one thing, if you share this idea that whether you get up on a Sunday and you think religion's great or you can't understand it, that's my student Andrew Marnie pointed that out. It's interesting. Go figure it out. We've done a little work. You got to do the next amount of work. So, but I like the Pulotu database. I'm very proud of the work that Joseph Watts and Oliver Sheehan and Russell Gray, who's now Max Planck director, did in setting that up, and I was happy to be part of that because you can play with the data, you can visualize the cultural variation. That's a lot of fun.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the video. And Dr. Bulbulia, it was again a real pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you a lot for taking the time.
Likewise, Ricardo, I'm grateful for your interest, and wish you all the best. And please come to New Zealand at some point and get in touch. It's a lovely place.
Okay, I will try to do that in the future. Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics from a variety of fields. So just to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you can also do it via PayPal and Subscribestar. All of the links will be in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my Patreons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jana Enninen, and my first producer, Izar Weber. Thank you for all.